When we imagine life inside a medieval monastery or convent, our minds often conjure images of quiet contemplation, solemn prayer, and a life detached from the messy realities of the world. The historical record, however, paints a much more complicated and frankly more human picture. The men and women who took holy vows were still people, subject to the same passions, temptations, and political pressures as everyone else. While many lived lives of sincere devotion, the stone walls of the cloister couldn't always keep human nature out. Sometimes this resulted in scandals that were whispered about for centuries, recorded by bishops, and even used to justify the dismantling of the entire monastic system. Today, we're not going to look at myths or legends. We're going to look at 3 documented historical cases that reveal what could happen when vows were broken and authority was challenged. These are real stories drawn from visitation records, chronicles, and court documents. Chapter 1. The Nun of Watton. Our first story comes from 12th century Yorkshire, England, and it's preserved in a detailed account by a prominent churchman, Aelred of Rievaulx. It concerns a young woman known to history only as the Nun of Watton. The Gilbertine order at Watton was unique in that it housed both men and women in separate cloisters on the same grounds. The young nun had been placed in the priory as a small child, a common practice at the time, and she grew up knowing no other life. But she was rebellious and, according to Aelred, she struggled deeply with the strictures of her vocation. Her life changed when she began a clandestine affair with a canon from the men's side of the priory. It was a deeply forbidden relationship, and it resulted in the nun becoming pregnant. In the suffocatingly close environment of the priory, her secret couldn't last. The other nuns, whom Aelred describes as acting with a ferocious piety, discovered her condition. Their reaction was swift and brutal. They reported her to the senior canons, who then orchestrated a trap. They forced the pregnant nun to lure her lover to a meeting spot where he was ambushed and seized. What followed was an act of shocking violence. The canons handed the man over to the enraged nuns. In a frenzy, they held him down while one of the canons castrated him. Aelred's account then forces a final, horrific degradation upon the young nun. She was made to hold the severed results of this mutilation. After this, the nun was thrown into a squalid cell, bound in heavy chains to await the inevitable public shame of childbirth. But here the story takes a turn from the brutal to the bizarre. Aelred, writing for a pious audience, introduces a miracle. He writes that the disgraced nun received a vision of the recently deceased Archbishop of York. After a stern lecture, he supposedly blessed her, at which point her chains fell off and her pregnancy simply vanished. When her jailers checked on her, they found a slim woman in an empty cell. There was no baby, no evidence of birth, nothing. So what really happened? Historians are divided. Aelred was writing a piece of hagiography, a text meant to inspire faith. A convenient miracle that covers up a scandal is very much on brand. It's more likely that the nun either suffered a miscarriage due to the trauma, or that she gave birth to a child who was secretly and swiftly given away. Or perhaps, more grimly, disposed of. Aelred's miraculous ending neatly resolves a deeply embarrassing and violent episode for the priory. The story of the Nun of Watton is a stark reminder of the intense pressures placed on individuals within these communities and the brutal lengths to which an institution might go to protect its reputation. Chapter 2. The Devils of Loudun. For our next case, we move forward in time to 17th century France, to the town of Loudun. While this is technically post-medieval, the events are rooted in a medieval worldview, one populated by demons, saints, and the constant threat of damnation. This story revolves around one man, Father Urbain Grandier. Grandier was not a humble parish priest. He was intelligent, handsome, politically connected, and known for his sharp tongue and his series of amorous affairs. He was a man who collected enemies, and his most powerful one was Cardinal Richelieu, the de facto ruler of France. Grandier had once publicly slighted the cardinal and had written a book attacking the rule of clerical celibacy, a direct challenge to church doctrine. In 1632, the trouble began. A group of Ursuline nuns at the local convent, led by their prioress, a woman named Jeanne d'Ange, began to display signs of what was called demonic possession. They convulsed, shouted blasphemies, and made shocking accusations. They claimed that it was Father Grandier, in his capacity as a powerful sorcerer, who had sent a host of demons to torment their bodies and souls. The situation quickly spiraled into a public spectacle. Exorcisms were held in the open, drawing massive crowds. The nuns would put on a terrifying performance, writhing on the floor, speaking in supposed demonic voices, and describing in graphic detail their spiritual and intimate assaults by the demons under Grandier's command. Grandier protested his innocence, claiming the whole affair was a fraud orchestrated by his political enemies. But there was good reason to be skeptical. The nuns' stories were inconsistent. At one point, a physician who examined the prioress concluded she was more in need of a doctor than an exorcist. But the momentum was against Grandier. Cardinal Richelieu saw his chance to eliminate a critic. He appointed a special commission led by a man known to hate Grandier to oversee the entire trial. The proceedings were a farce. The primary evidence was a supposed pact with the devil, signed by Grandier in his own blood. It was almost certainly a forgery. Grandier was subject to intense torture to extract a confession. His legs were shattered in a device called the boot, but he never broke. He maintained his innocence to the end. Found guilty of witchcraft, he was burned at the stake in the town square at 1634. The Loudun possessions serve as one of history's most chilling examples of how mass hysteria, personal vendettas, and political power can combine to create a deadly injustice. By the way, if you're finding these deep dives into the historical record interesting, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps, and it ensures you won't miss our future explorations into these kinds of stories. Now, let's head back to England for our final case. Chapter 3: Littlemore Priory. Our final story takes place at Littlemore Priory, near Oxford, in the early 16th century. It's a small scandal at a small institution, but it became a piece of a much larger puzzle, one that ended with King Henry VIII tearing the English church apart. In 1517, the Bishop of Lincoln sent commissioners to inspect the priory, a standard procedure. The report they sent back was damning. They found the priory in a state of almost total collapse, both financially and morally. And at the center of it was the prioress, Catherine Wells. The commissioners discovered that Prioress Wells had given birth to a daughter, fathered by a local priest named Richard Hughes. She had been stealing items from the priory, linens, pots, and even a feather bed, to provide a dowry for this illegitimate child. To make matters worse, another nun at the priory, Juliana Winter, had also recently had a baby. The prioress had even pawned the convent's silver salt cellars to help pay for that child's care. The report paints a picture of a place where vows were an afterthought. This is a story that has often been sensationalized, with later accounts claiming Catherine Wells committed infanticide. But the primary source, the bishop's report, is clear. The child was alive and had been sent to live with her father. The prioress wasn't a monster, she was a woman trying, however illicitly, to provide for her daughter. The scandal at Littlemore was exactly the kind of evidence that men like Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's chief minister, were looking for a decade later. When Henry decided to break with the Pope in Rome, he needed a justification to seize the immense wealth of England's monasteries. He launched a massive propaganda campaign, portraying the monasteries and convents as dens of corruption and sin. The visitation records, filled with accounts like the one from Littlemore, were his proof. The report on Catherine Wells was used as a textbook example of monastic decay, helping to justify the dissolution of the monasteries, a policy that would permanently change the landscape and culture of England. In a fascinating modern postscript, recent archaeological work at the site of Littlemore Priory had unearthed its cemetery. Among the skeletons of the nuns, they found the carefully buried remains of a stillborn infant. We can't know whose child it was, but it's a physical echo of the secrets buried at Littlemore. These three stories, from the violent passions at Watton to the political theatre at Loudun and the quiet desperation of Littlemore, show us that the medieval and early modern church was far from a monolith of perfect piety. It was a complex, sprawling institution populated by real people. People who loved, people who hated, who schemed, and who sometimes failed spectacularly to live up to the ideals they had sworn to uphold. These accounts aren't just scandalous gossip, they are valuable windows into the past, revealing the tensions between faith and human nature, between institutional power and individual lives. They remind us that history is never as simple as it seems. Check out my sources below and see you in the next one.